Welcome back. This is part 2 of the Globalization of the Cold War lecture. And you know what I was just thinking? I wish I had intro music, but I couldn't think of any good song that I could use for my intro song. So if you think of anything good, let me know. I'm looking to spice up these online lectures because it's seeming like we're gonna have to be doing these for a while. I'll add a question on the lecture quiz if you want to submit your idea for an intro song for my for my lectures. I'm trying to think of something that would be tying in really well to APRO, but again, nothing's coming for me, so I'm turning to you all for inspiration. Let me know if you think of anything good. Anyways, back to this. So the next thing we wanted to talk about was Korea and the Korean War, the Korean War is the first major conflict of the Cold War in terms of being an actual battle conflict. And it's also a test of sorts for the United Nations. This is the first time that the United Nations is going to be called into action into a military conflict like this. So it's a test to see, in some ways, how useful or effective is the United Nations going to be. So let's get going here. So Korea had actually been a colony of Japan in the early 1900s, and it had not been North and South Korea. It had just been regular Korea. But after Japan loses World War II, they also lose all of their territories that they had invaded during the war, and they lose all their colonies, and that includes Korea. So Korea for a really long time had been under Japanese control, and so when the war is over, the United States and the Soviet Union basically decide to do the same thing with Korea that they had done with Germany. They decide to take it, split the country in half, and they will each be in charge of rebuilding their section of Korea, physically rebuilding, and as well as putting a new, government into place. And so they divide it along what's called the 38th parallel. It is a latitude line, and the Soviet Union administers the northern part of Korea, so north of the 38th parallel, which becomes known as North Korea. And the United States is in charge of the part of Korea below the 38th parallel, so South Korea. So they each help rebuild, and they set up governments, and then they basically leave by the, late 1940s, the United States and the Soviet Union are not really in Korea anymore. They're not occupying Korea. They have helped rebuild it. They've set up governments, and they bounced. But obviously the two governments that they set up were very different. In North Korea, the Soviets set up a pro-Soviet communist government. So, they started doing all the same things that the Soviet Union was doing, centrally planning the government, collectivizing agriculture, stuff like that. They have a totalitarian regime, very few freedoms. If you know anything about North Korea today, you know that it's still that way, and it's still pretty horrible. Meanwhile, in South Korea, the United States set up a capitalist democratic system, and they, became in many ways a very modern, advanced country with a lot of the same sort of rights and freedoms, and a lot of the same technologies and all that kind of stuff as the United States and other parts of Europe have. So the intention was initially, just like with Germany, that yes, Korea would be split, so it could be sort of rebuilt, but eventually the idea was that it would be reunified. But because the two governments in North Korea and in South Korea were so different, it became pretty clear pretty quickly that there was not going to be a natural unification between the two, because they had totally different governments. So in 1950, North Korea decides that they are going to unify the two Koreas. And they are going to do this by basically invading South Korea. So in 1950, the North Koreans said, we're here to peacefully unify the Koreas, except they rolled across the 38th parallel with tanks and with a military. And so the artist in this political cartoon is really criticizing the North Koreans here. You can see that the title of the cartoon is The Peace Movement in Korea, with peace in quotation marks, meaning, they're casting doubt on the idea that it is peaceful. And then, of course, just everything in the drawing suggests that it's not a peaceful unification or a peaceful movement. You have a dove, which is typically the symbol of peace, but this dove has angry, teeth, an angry beak, something. We can tell that it's North Korean because it has the symbol of communism on it, the hammer and the sickle. And then the dove is also not very peaceful because it's also a giant tank that is rolling through South Korea, crushing people as it goes. So yeah. So initially, when this begins, it is in 1950. The North Koreans, like I said, they cross over the 38th parallel and they basically sweep into South Korea. Within a very short amount of time, they had almost taken over the entirety of Korea. And it seems like for like a quick second there, like, oh my gosh, the North Koreans are gonna, take all of Korea for themselves. It's gonna be one big communist nation. And this is not good if you're the United States or any of our allies. So at this point in time, the US actually goes to the United Nations and asks the United Nations for help, for military assistance for the South Koreans. The United States basically says, like, look, this is an unprompted invasion by the North Koreans. This is an act of war. We need to help defend the people who are being invaded. So that question comes to the Security Council. And they're the ones who, as I've said before, they get to make the decision about what's actually going to happen. Will the United Nations grant military assistance to South Korea? So we've got our 5 permanent members on the Security Council. The United States obviously votes yes. The United Nations should help South Korea. France votes yes. Great Britain votes yes. China, well, representing the Republic of China, not the communists, they vote yes. Now, the last member of the Security Council, the Soviet Union, these would be the people that you would obviously expect would vote no. They would veto. They would veto this decision, and the United Nations wouldn't be able to help South Korea, and South Korea might have totally fallen to the North Koreans. But, and here's where this is all going to come for full circle, remember how I told you that the Soviet Union had stopped showing up to the United Nations. They were boycotting the UN because they were upset over who got to sit in the China seat. They were upset that a person from the Republic of China was sitting there instead of a person from Communist China, the People's Republic of China. So the Soviet Union was not sitting in their seat at the United Nations in 1950 when this question comes to the Security Council. They were boycotting, so they couldn't veto. So therefore, the United Nations goes forward with supplying military aid to South Korea, which is, it's obviously a huge deal. And of course, maybe karma to the Soviets for not showing up. Anyways, so what ends up happening is that the United Nations springs into action. I absolutely love this political cartoon because I think it's I just love the layout of it and the drawing of it. Here is the American president at the time, which was President Truman, and he's hand in hand with the United Nations because, of course, the United States is sort of the one leading the charge on all of this. The United Nations has this, sort of weapon of sorts, and they're sort of dashing forward to save the South Koreans. And as they do it, they're running over the grave of the League of Nations, who died from lack of exercise. So we know that the League of Nations was basically totally useless, especially when it came to military issues. We know that, for instance, the League of Nations did not intervene when the Italians invaded Ethiopia, despite the fact that the Ethiopians asked for military assistance. So the cartoon is really showing that the United Nations is very different from the League of Nations. The League of Nations died because it couldn't really do much. The United Nations is going to be something different. So history does not repeat itself. People had learned that the League of Nations basically sucked, and the United Nations needed the power to be able to grant military assistance if it was going to be a useful organization at all. So, there we go. So with the help of the United Nations military assistance, those UN troops were 80% of them were troops from the United States. So a lot of times when we think about the Korean War, people think of the US and the South Koreans versus the North Koreans, and that's pretty accurate. For the United States, this was actually never a declared war. It was a conflict that we contributed American troops towards the United Nations military group. But anyways, mostly Americans and then some Canadians and British and folks like that jump in. They land in South Korea, and very quickly they're able to push the North Koreans almost completely out. And again, for a hot second, it looks like the Americans and the South Koreans and their allies are going to be able to take all of Korea for themselves. But then something bad happens, from the United States point of view anyways, and that is China, the People's Republic of China, Communist China, by 1952, when this is all happening is like, okay, we need to come and help our communist brothers and sisters in North Korea. So the Chinese start sending thousands of troops over the Yalu River into North Korea. They're sending thousands and thousands of dollars worth of military supplies to assist the communists. And essentially they push the UN forces led by the Americans out of most of North Korea. And in the last year and a half of the war, they basically have a stalemate. Neither side is really gaining any territory or making any progress. They're both just kind of stuck fighting in the same spot. And so eventually in 1954, both sides kind of call it. They're like, you know what, we're not making any progress. Neither of us is really winning. Let's just have a truce, essentially. So they sign what's called an armistice. It is not a full peace treaty. So technically they are still at war with each other. It is just like a ceasefire, essentially, like a fancy ceasefire. So what they decided was that they were going to split Korea once again, very close to where it was split originally. They were going to create what's called, pull it up on my next slide. They're going to create what's called the DMZ. It stands for Demilitarized Zone. Essentially, along the border between North and South Korea, there's about half a mile of land on either side that is basically empty. What they've done is essentially they've created a buffer zone. They've created a way for the two Koreas to not actually physically touch each other. And in the DMZ, there's fences on either side, and it's basically a 1 mile strip of land with absolutely nothing in it. And again, that's a way to prevent the border issues, any kind of border skirmish. You can also see on this map, it does a good job of showing you where the modern day border between North and South Korea is compared to the old border, the 38th parallel, and it's pretty much the same. So when we think about the Korean War and we're thinking about is this a win or is this a loss for the US or for the Soviets? And it's kind of both and neither at the same time. From the American point of view, it's a win because we prevented the spread of communism. We successfully contained communism, although at great expense. Americans lost thousands of lives in Korea and spent millions of dollars there. However, it's also a loss in that regard, we lost money and lives, but the Americans also, we lost the ability to reclaim all of Korea under a capitalist democratic government. And the same is said for the Soviet Union and for their communist allies, the Chinese, that it's a win in the sense that they prevented North Korea from being lost to capitalism, but they also failed to gain all of Korea for themselves. So a lot of people see the Korean War as a very frustrating conflict because it feels kind of pointless. There was all this fighting and all this conflict only to end up in back to square one, essentially. One thing we do see from the outcome of the Korean War is we do see that the Chinese are going to be a challenging power in Asia for the United States to fight. It was because of the Chinese that the North Koreans were able to reclaim all of North Korea. I'm going to go back if I can. In the political cartoon down here that pops up for this panel of the map, it was, like I said, the overwhelming red forces. The Reds are what we call the communists from the American point of view. They were the ones who were able to push us all the way back when we were so close to claiming all of Korea for sort of the capitalist democratic side. And so this political cartoon from this time period is making a reference to that. Here we have a member of the United Nations, and he's sort of pointing at the Chinese Reds, at someone who represents communist China, and they're reading the tea leaves. If you're not familiar with this idea, it's a very old Asian practice where you would drink loose leaf tea in a teacup, and then when you're done drinking the tea, whatever pattern that the little tea leaves have left on the bottom of the cup, either reveals something about you or tells your future or something like that. If you've read or watched Harry Potter, this is similar to Professor Trelawney does this. Anyways, that's just, point of reference. So anyways, here the cartoon is all the tea leaves in China. So they're reading the tea leaves. They're trying to find out the truth about the Korean War. And this cartoonist believes that, the UN and other folks recognize that the Chinese are the true aggressor. They are the ones who have contributed the most to the Korean War. They are the ones almost to blame the most. And so what the Korean War revealed was number one, the United Nations had military power. They could exercise that, and they could exercise it effectively because they were able to defend South Korea from the North Koreans. The second thing we learned from the Korean War is that the Chinese are going to be a very powerful force in Asia when it comes to supporting communism. And so that's going to be something that plays out. We'll see it play out again in the Vietnam War, for instance, which we'll be talking about in the second half of the lecture about decolonization. And also later in chapter 29, they talk about it as well. So that's that piece. Before we move on to the Cuban Missile Crisis, again, we're going to stop here, and I'll make one last video for the Cuban Missile Crisis before we move on to the decolonization part of this lecture. So I will catch up with you in a few minutes.